The Counteroffensive's Tim Mak joins from Ukraine to explain a new push inside the country to codify civilian gun rights. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNET contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America and actually across the world sometimes, as we'll get into on this episode. First, I want to mention that this episode is brought to you by The Dispatch. I'll talk a little bit more about them at the end. Great publication. I'm a subscriber. I'll tell you why when we get to the end of the episode. But first, we are going to be discussing Ukraine. The war is still ongoing there, and there's actually been some interesting developments on the gun rights side of things inside of Ukraine. And so to discuss that, we have an independent reporter who started his own publication and reports live from Ukraine every day. And it's joining us now, Tim Mak of the Counteroffensive with Tim Mak. Welcome to the show, Tim. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, can you just give us a little bit more, just give us a little background on what the Counteroffensive is,
Sure.
When you started it and why?
Yeah, so last May, I decided to leave my role as a correspondent for NPR and start my own company out here in Kyiv, my own publication called The Counteroffensive. And what we do is, I think what we do is we fill a need in the news ecosystem. Instead of telling you what happened in the world today as it relates to Ukraine, we go deep into the story of a single person or a very small group of people, tell you about their lives, and in so doing, give you a sense of what the news is. So we do deeply reported human interest stories as a way to get news of what's happening here in the war out to English-speaking audiences in the West. That's been our specialty, and that's kind of how we approached the gun issue when we did a story on it earlier this month.
Yeah. And I'm a subscriber to the Counteroffensive, have been since it launched. Re-upped my subscription just recently as you had your 1 year anniversary, and I recommend the publication to everybody because like you said, it's an independent publication where you're actually on the ground and you're actually interviewing people in the middle of this war. And this war is it's very important on the world stage, but it also has these interesting aspects that cross over with my independent publication here at The Reload, which is the gun policy. The gun debate in Ukraine has obviously amped up quite a bit over the last several years. And now it appears there's even an active effort, perhaps seems like it's going fairly well too, to actually enshrine gun rights protections in the nation's laws. You profiled this activist or this politician who's going down this road. Can you give us just some of the basic starting line of what this story was about and who this person is?
Yeah, so we profiled this man, Maryan Zablotskiy. He's a member of Zelenskyy's party, the Servant of the People Party. He's a member of parliament here in Ukraine, and he has deep ties with the conservative movement in the United States. He's one of the authors of a bill that would essentially provide a right to firearms for all civilian Ukrainians, creating a universal right. It's not quite as strong. It's not a constitutional amendment, so it wouldn't be quite this, it wouldn't be like the Second Amendment in the United States, but it would be the first law of its kind that would guarantee a general right to firearms for civilians. So he's been doing a lot of work on this. I can get into both kind of his desire to arm as many civilians as possible, as well as his kind of legislative priorities and what he's trying to do in parliament. And we can expand on that a little bit, especially since, there's a unique aspect of all of this, right? And, usually when we're talking about gun rights, we're not talking about a country that's in the middle of an active conflict or a war zone. Ukraine is in the middle of an active war where a lot of people have been changing their minds about the appropriate regulations around guns, given that there have been a lot of atrocities and war crimes committed by Russia in this country. People like Maryan Zablotskiy, they believe that tyrants really only understand the language of violence, and the only way to respond to authoritarianism is to arm the broader public.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that strikes me about reading the piece are some of the quotes that he gave you guys, because they're very, very similar to what you hear in the United States from gun rights activists. Here, just for as an example, he said, quote, "If we had the same gun ownership percentage as the United States does, Russia would never have dared to invade us." That's a super common point of view. He also, in the United States, about just civilian gun ownership, civilians being armed. He also said, quote, "There are more guns in the U.S. than necessary for the population's safety. Therefore, I thought some Americans might be willing to share excess firearms and donate them to Ukrainians in need." So he's also like pointing to this program, and we'll get a little bit deeper into this later, because it's fascinating to me. It sounds a lot like what we did during World War II with the British. There were private drives in addition to what the government was sending over in Lend Lease. There were private drives to collect firearms and send them to the British public as well. And it sounds like that's also happening here with Ukraine, but which is one fascinating aspect of this. But this dude, he sounds a lot like, he might be a spokesperson for the NRA, and that's not a common thing to come across in Europe, right?
Well, this is someone who has, pretty extensive ties with, Republicans of the right in the United States. And, he mentioned to me that he had been to Grover Norquist's weekly meeting in Washington, D.C., which is a regular meeting of conservative activists.
The Wednesday
that
meeting.
Get together. The Wednesday meeting. And what they do is they get together and they talk about how to advance the conservative cause through their various activism and different organizations. So he's connected with that group, and what he was able to do with his connections with on the right in the United States is to organize the transfer of firearms donated by American gun activists, as well as he managed to create a process whereby the Miami Police Department was able to do a gun buyback and then ship any firearms that they gathered to Ukraine, which is where they ended up with police and other kind of territorial defense units.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating too. That's kind of another maybe scrambling of what you might think of as normal politics, because gun buybacks, people who operate gun buybacks are usually not wanting to give those guns to anyone else. They want to have them destroyed or what have you. But in this case, he's managed to create this program where they get sent to Ukrainians to use in this defensive war against the invading Russians. So he's kind of cobbled together a very interesting supporting cast here for this effort, and it sounds like they've gotten pretty far. These guns are actually reaching the territorial defense groups now. That can you explain how those work? Is that like the National Guard we would think of here in the United States, or obviously Ukraine being in a hot war right now, things are a little different.
Yeah, I think that's the best. Yeah, I think that's the best analogy. Yeah, so they're the kind of like local territorial militias, I guess. They're regionally based, so they don't get sent from their particular region to the front. They're responsible for their particular zone, and so the territorial defense units, closer to the Russian border of Ukraine, they're obviously in greater need of military aid and equipment than territorial defense units further away. Now, the territorial defense unit that Zablotskiy, in this case, managed to get weapons to, it's a unique territorial defense region. It's called the Irpin region. Now, you may remember when the full-scale invasion started in 2022, Irpin, which is near Bucha, which is near Ostomel, these are Kyiv area regions that were absolutely devastated in the initial weeks of the invasion, as the Russians were shelling central Kyiv. And ultimately, when the Russians withdrew from these areas, a lot of atrocities were uncovered. People who were executed summarily or tortured, interrogated, beaten, all sorts of war crimes became evident after Russia withdrew from that region. And so they have these memories and this history that relates to civilians feeling like they didn't have the weaponry necessary to protect themselves.
Interesting. Yeah. And so I mean, we saw this at the beginning of the invasion, right? There was sort of a more haphazard effort to kind of arm anyone who was willing to be armed inside of Ukraine. They were handing out AKs on the street, right? And this seems like it's become much more of a organized effort now to implement gun rights in the country in a more formal, legally protected way. And it does seem like, yeah, like you're talking about, it seems like there's been a lot of lived experience that's gone into that, including perhaps beyond the war crimes aspect, people seeing war crimes and now wanting to have something to be able to defend themselves if that were to become a possibility again. But also I know there have been stories of, these civilians being involved in some of those early defensive stands that, not by themselves necessarily, but perhaps supplementing what the Ukrainian military was doing at the time, because the early invasion was very chaotic experience, right? Especially, even compared to now. What can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the early part of the invasion was particularly chaotic, and a lot of, even now, 2 years later, it remains kind of the probably one of the most salient memories of Ukrainian civilians is how off guard a lot of them felt by the full scale invasion, and how vulnerable they felt, and many folks don't want to feel that way again. Now, I haven't seen polling on Ukraine and how they feel about this particular law, and there's a lot of different opinions on this. But one thing that is clear is that Ukraine is a country, one of the very few countries in the world where regulations regarding firearms is not set in law, not regulated by law. So they're restricted right now. Firearms are through rules set by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, not a specific law. And while the parliament has debated this issue for many, many years, decades, even since the 1990s, there hasn't yet been a law that enshrines or lays out specifically what kind of access Ukrainian civilians have to weapons, and whether that's something that the country wants to provide for all sorts of folks. I mean, this is a debate that really started in earnest in 2014 with with Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, and a hot war in eastern Ukraine, and this issue of whether firearms should be provided to civilians or whether civilians in general should have broad access to firearms has been debated for many years without resolution.
Right, because there were some emergency measures at the very beginning, right? They were more about the right to self-defense, I guess, from what I recall. But they're, like you mentioned, they didn't go all the way to actually codifying a regime for firearms regulation, right? It still was fairly haphazard and has been up to this point. Now, this law, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And right now, during martial law, legislation aside, whether it passes or doesn't, the current rule is as the war goes on, no one but military and law enforcement can carry firearms outside of training facilities and outside of storage areas.
Okay. So even if this passes, you still, I guess, so the practical effect in the immediate term wouldn't be massive. Is that right?
Yes, but one thing that is clear is that the Rada, which is the Ukrainian parliament, it has passed this bill that Zablotskiy has worked on. It's already passed the bill in what's called its first reading. So it'll need to go through a second consideration by parliament, and if that happens, it would need to be signed by President Zelenskyy, and then it could become law and implemented several years after the war ends. I think that's what the legislation says. Now, this is interesting to me, right? Because Zelenskyy is not exactly the biggest idol of the American right at the moment. But on this gun issue, I think there's an interesting coalition or an interesting point to be made to a lot of your listeners. I know a lot of your listeners are gun enthusiasts and activists on the Second Amendment, and this is Zelenskyy's party pushing something that I think a lot of your listeners would generally approve.
Yeah, this is something that we've kept an eye on in places like Ukraine and Israel that have seen these, these attacks and more come, to their streets, and that seems to have changed at least some people's minds on gun ownership, which is kind of a fascinating thing to watch in cultures where it's obviously it's viewed very differently than here in the United States, but not necessarily by everybody, right? That's what we're seeing now, that some, like perhaps more and more people in places like Ukraine and Israel are coming over the American view of gun ownership.
I wonder, and I think that there's this sort of unique vulnerability that, particularly in places where there's deep instability and you can't rely on the government to provide safety. There are places in the Middle East where essentially every family will have an AK because they live in particularly rural areas, or there's no local police force. And so I would expect in those places people to take defense into their own hands, and self-defense is a priority through gun ownership. In Ukraine, so far, only about 2% of adult Ukrainians own a gun. And this is according to Zablotskiy. So the rate of ownership to date has been quite low. Then again, if you talk to most Ukrainians, they will tell you that they did not expect a full-scale invasion of the scale that Russia has now engaged in over the last 2 years plus. Not very, very few people, if any, imagined a war which has lasted since February 2022, which is leading to profound suffering, millions of refugees, constant blackouts all across the country, rising unemployment, hysterical inflation, just suffering for tens of millions of people. And they may be, I think this is part of one of the major shifts that may be happening in Ukrainian society about the future. You may see them. And one of the analogs, and you mentioned Israel, for what Ukraine's future might be, is kind of Israel, as kind of hedgehog type state where people are very well trained militarily, that defenses of the country are built up to a point where this can't possibly happen again.
That's interesting. That is a fascinating analog there between those two nations, and I could absolutely see that happening. And I think it's another interesting point too, because obviously this war, or the full-scale war directly with Russia, has been going on since 2022, which is a long time. But the Ukrainians have been fighting that sort of proxy war in the East for even longer, right? Yeah. And so I think while only 2% of them may report owning a gun, a lot of them have had experience with the military, right? Because they'll get cycled in and out at some point over the last decade or so, right? In the fighting.
Sure, but right now the rules are pretty strict. So while they do have a lot more experience with firearms, general ownership by civilian, you need special permits.
You can't own them.
The very, very few people can own them. Yeah. I wouldn't say that it's impossible, but it's certainly not like in the United States where it's enshrined in law that people ought to have access to them. And so it's just a different approach. And of course, I have to emphasize that, this is a pretty controversial topic.
Yeah. But that attitude is changing, at least among some. Just to give one more quote from Zablotskiy here, and he, like I said earlier, he mentioned that some civilians or some people armed through these programs have actually been effective in resisting the Russians at various points. He mentions shooting down drones with small arms. But he also says, quote, I want to ensure the best possible security guarantees for Ukraine by allowing everyone to own a firearm. If Russians enter Bucha or other areas where they committed atrocities, they should know they'll face resistance from every window, which is very similar to a line you hear often in American gun culture about, I think it's apocryphal, but it's from the World War II, where Japanese Admiral, I believe it was supposed to be Yamamoto, said that they couldn't invade America because there'd be a rifle behind every blade of grass. It's very similar imagery you're seeing here. But I do want to get to this other point you just mentioned, which is not necessarily majority view or overwhelming view, there are still plenty of people who hold that more European view of guns, that they should be reserved to police and military. And you actually had one of your writers articulate that view in another piece as part of this newsletter you sent out, right?
Well, that's right. So one of my reporters, Miroslava, she's let me start with the fact that she's not against gun ownership. And she says she's interested in guns. At some point this summer, I think me and my team were going to go to a gun range here in Kyiv and familiarize everyone with AKs. She's not against having a gun in her own home, and she's not against additional gun ownership in Ukraine. What she is opposing, though, is the current legislation's broad interpretation of how easily it should be, how easily guns should be accessible to the public. So right now, for example, you have to do training in order to receive a firearm, get a license to receive a firearm, and get a permit, and work through the police. And that's not something that's common in the United States. I don't think it happens anymore at all, actually. In sort of a formal legal permitting way. But here in Ukraine, there's a pretty strict check. You obviously have to be free of a criminal record. You need to undergo local training on firearms handling and safety, storage, that sort of thing. And then that all finalizes in getting a permit. So, Miroslava and her husband both are interested in owning a gun and familiarizing themselves with firearms. They're worried about the overproliferation of firearms. They're worried about a post-war period where you have a lot of soldiers with PTSD coming back and re-entering a society where there is a proliferation of firearms, and therefore a proliferation of potential for greater numbers of veteran suicide. They're worried about criminals getting access to these firearms when there aren't very many firearms in civilian society right now. Those are all concerns that they are raising as part of their opposition to this particular widening of the scope for civilian gun ownership in Ukraine.
Yeah, so it's a bit closer to the more traditional European civilian view of firearms ownership, maybe even a bit to the more pro-gun than your typical European, because they do, like you mentioned, they still think people should be able to own guns, but they want those more severe restrictions on it than what this proposes. So there is I was just trying to get, there's a debate, right? There's still a strong debate. You have experience covering the American gun debate. You wrote a whole book about the NRA, and the gun control movement is mentioned in there as well. So you've got experience covering it here. What is your take on where things are at now? Obviously, it must be a very different situation in a country where they're actively at war, that has a more European Soviet background. What is your view of how things are similar and how things are different?
Well, the veil has really been lifted on violence in this society, right? So it's no longer something that just happens abstractly in really far off places. This is happening to people's husbands and sons and brothers. And so there's a deep anger and anxiety in this society. And I wonder if this is the right time to be making decisions about firearms and guns. The legislation does talk about how there is a kind of, a waiting period between when the legislation is enacted and when the rules start to take effect, of several years. But you can see that, Ukrainian society has gone through the most traumatic experience in a generation. Probably the most traumatic thing since the end of World War II. I'm trying to think of any, similarly destructive events. On this scale, this is one of the most devastating things to happen to a society. There are going to be a lot of people with mental health problems. There's going to be a lot of challenges to the economy, and sudden changes to gun laws I think these regulations ought to be well considered in the context of broader social problems. That's my concern. As someone who's been in the U.S. military and seen evolving views of evolving views among the veterans community about suicide, depression, anxiety, PTSD. I worry that bringing a lot more firearms into civilian hands will make it easier for problems to occur after a lot of very, very traumatized people return from the front lines and try to reintegrate back into society.
Yeah, certainly. That's always a risk. But it does seem like, given how far this bill has gone, that a lot of people do share these views of they don't want to be left defenseless, right? I mean, is that, do you hear
Obviously,
that when you speak to sources in the field out there? Or?
There are so many issues going on, right? I think one thing that you put your finger on that I think is correct is that the more people have military training, the more people feel comfortable with firearms, the more people are, are interested in or able to use in a safe way firearms in a civilian setting. And that changes the whole attitude in society towards the issue of firearms ownership. And I do understand from people who have lived in areas that have been occupied by the Russians why they would never want to feel defenseless as they did and caught off guard as they did in the early days of the war. Why they would never want to feel that way again. I'm not Ukrainian, and I don't want to kind of tiptoe too far into how they should be doing their laws. But I can certainly understand why this legislation has received passage in its first reading and is on its way to possibly become a law.
Yeah, but I guess the question is just more like, do you see that organically when you're? I mean, like you said, I guess people maybe are more concerned about their day-to-day survival, both at the in areas that are actively under attack or just economic.
I'll tell you, the things we talk about are movements on the front lines, drone technology developments, and the constant blackouts. Those are the things that we talk about all the time. Me, for example, if I wanted to get a firearm here in Ukraine right now, I could not get one. And I haven't talked to a lot of people who are like, I really need one now. But I think I imagine the situation changes the further you get out of the city, particularly towards the Russian.
Yeah, but if somebody wants to be armed right now and they're Ukrainian civilian, can they just join one of these territorial defense court? Like, how does it actually, I know that we were talking about sort of the law, the legal aspect of it, but in practice, presumably if you wanted to be armed, you could go and join one of these groups and be armed that way. Is that a real option for most people, or how does it work?
Sure, but that involves the possibility of mobilization. That involves, obviously quite a big step. It's not like joining, not like getting a library card. It involves various responsibilities and commitments, and so if you're just looking to obtain a firearm, it may not be worth it to you. That's an individual decision, but that would be one way for a civilian who didn't want to go into the hot zone and go to the front lines immediately, but also wanted to get a firearm. That's one way to get access to training and access to firearms.
Yeah, certainly. So it's not something that every civilian can realistically do at this point.
At this point,
which I guess is
at this point, you're not
the necessity
really
for this legislation.
Yeah, at this point, if you're an average civilian, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to get a firearm.
Okay. And you mentioned there getting a firearm yourself. As a war correspondent, somebody who's running a publication in an active war zone, what are the ethics of presumably you're not going around armed. I know that's not a common thing for war correspondents, right? How do you navigate all of that, the danger of it, and the impulse for self-defense in a situation like that?
Yeah, well, for example, because this is a war setting, there are issues related to combatants, right? Could you be reasonably viewed by a military force to be a combatant? Me picking up a firearm could make me a valid target. Not wanting to do that and wanting to do journalism, I'm not here to fight, I'm here to report. Doesn't make a lot of sense for me to be armed. And the threat if you're not right on the front lines, the threats are missiles and drones, and small arms really aren't going to help you with those threat scenarios. So for me, it hasn't made a lot of sense. I think that, to be prepared as a war correspondent here in Ukraine, you're a lot better worrying about things like water purification, batteries, emergency communications, things like that. Right now I'm talking to you on a backup cell phone line using a EcoFlow battery to power my computer. So those are the things I'm worried about the most, and a lot less about firearms for myself.
Right. Makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's common, right, for war correspondents, because you don't want to be, you're there to document what's going on. You're not there to join into the fighting, and you want to avoid that as much as you possibly can. Right.
Yeah. I want to, I don't want to be a participant in the combat. This is my own perspective. Different correspondents will have different perspectives, but I don't want to be in a position where I'm within 100 meters of, Russian troops and I'm, they're firing at me with small arms. I don't want to be in that. I'm not sure I'm bringing a lot to the table if I'm getting shot at.
Right. Certainly. And so speaking of which, can you just tell us a little bit more about the counteroffensive itself? What, if people want to follow your on the ground reporting, this is a totally independent publication, right? How's it funded? What do you guys focus on? What are you looking forward to in the future here?
Sure. So like the Reload, we're just subscriber based. There's no kind of Bezos style money behind the publication. There's no grants. What we do is what we hope is, high impact reporting that focuses on human profiles and try to make these personal stories more immersive and more stories that connect with folks thousands of miles away in a deeper way. So the counteroffensive has done profiles of, for example, recently the gray zone, this crossing. There's only one crossing between Russia and Ukraine where people can walk from one side to the other in order to escape Russia and get into Ukraine. So we profiled that gray zone, what it's like to cross there. We embedded with an energy team that is trying to repair power plants that have been targeted by Russian missiles. There are now rolling blackouts all across the country that have disrupted daily life in Ukraine. And these are the teams that are working to try to change it. Another story we did was about the rise of gambling addiction on the front lines. And we profiled someone who's addicted to gambling. And he's seeking therapy, not for the shrapnel in his neck, or from his time in the trenches, but for his compulsion and his inability to gamble in a responsible manner, in ways that have led his family into really serious financial difficulties because of that. And we've been looking at the Ukrainian legislation meant to try to curb some of that, as well as talking to psychologists about where this sort of gambling addiction stems from, why troops who are under such stress are prone to addiction, and why it's become such an issue here in Ukraine when there are so many things to be thinking about already.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, as you just laid out there, I think that's pretty different from what you'll get from the sort of thousand yard view that you tend to see on larger news broadcasts. So I think the work you're doing is very important, which is why I'm a subscriber and I recommend it to other people. If people want to subscribe, how can they do that?
Well, they can go to www.counteroffensive.news, and they can take a look at what we have put out there, and it's free to subscribe. We do have a paid subscription for some of our stories, but a lot of it is also available to the public because we're committed to making these stories from Ukraine available, even though it's, it obviously costs a lot to report from Ukraine and under kind of grueling circumstances. But we're totally committed to continuing to do this reporting and get these stories out to the West so that they can understand more deeply what's happening over here.
All right, wonderful. Well, look, we appreciate you taking time, using up some of your battery and internet connection to do this with us. I know it's not easy to put this all together, especially the time delay and everything that's going on over there. So we really appreciate you doing this. And I would encourage people again to go check out your reporting because it is top notch. But that's all we've got for this week. I'm also now going to give you a little bit of pitch about the Dispatch, which I think is another independent publication that people should check out as well. There's a lot of great publications out there that are beyond that top tier of instantly known ones that tend to, frankly, generate a lot of garbage. What else to say? That's why we only recommend certain publications here at The Reload. So that's all we've got for you. Check out the Counteroffensive and then give the Dispatch a look as well. That's right. This episode is brought to you by the Dispatch. We're doing one of these classic promo swaps with them, actually on Kevin Williamson's newsletter, which is one that I personally subscribe to and read pretty much every time it comes out. I've actually been a paying subscriber to the Dispatch since they launched. They have over 400,000 readers now. Jonah Goldberg and Steve Hayes and Chris Steyerwalt and Ala Pundit. There's so many people who write over there that I've long followed and respected and enjoyed their perspective. And of course, in addition to a lot of the great commentary that they have from people that you probably know better than me, the people who are more well-known than I, they also have a lot of really deep and original news reporting that they do. And so that's why I've been happy to have them as one of our sponsors, as a promo swap. I would definitely stand behind their work and recommend it to you guys in a way that I couldn't say for a lot of other publications out there. So, if you're interested in checking out the Dispatch, if you haven't heard of it before, or you haven't taken the time to go over and examine what they're bringing into the world from a journalistic standpoint, I think you should do it. And in fact, part of our promo swap includes a 30-day free trial for their paid version. So you'll get access to everything they have for free for 30 days. So you can read it and make up your own mind. Just follow the link in the description here or in our newsletter this week at The Reload. So that honestly, I just do legitimately recommend them. And so I'm glad to do this sort of promo swap because they're one of my favorite publications. And I think you guys will enjoy them if you enjoy what we do here at The Reload. So check out the Dispatch today at the link in our description.
No, the devil's got no